All set? Okay. Well, you can open up in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 36. We won't be there very long at all. We'll be making our way, spend most of our time today in 37, 38, 39, and 40. Everybody getting there? Ready? Okay. Well, we have left off at the end of Genesis chapter 35, the end of this Toledot of Isaac, which is, again, Moses answering the question, what became of Isaac, and the life he was living, and the promises God had made to Abraham and to Isaac, and to their descendants after them, what took place. And we read that whole time kind of mostly about Jacob and Esau, and then really mostly about Jacob and his life. And that's sort of the way it is, right? When we say what became of you, we kind of mean, well, what, not just how did your life end, but what did you leave behind? What was the legacy? What was your imprint in the world? And for Isaac, it was Jacob. Jacob is what was left. Esau, we saw why that didn't turn out for Esau in his unwillingness and disinterestedness in the promises of God and the way of life that God was requiring. But Jacob was the one. And as for all of his faults, God worked in him in hard ways and mighty ways in the long term to change him into something different than he was. And we have we left off then at chapter 35, but let me just remind you, in chapter 34, Jacob's sons went out to avenge their daughter their sister, his daughter, who had been mistreated and abused in a town by the name of Shechem. It's known by that town, but the prince of that town, the guy whose father was ruler, his name is Shechem, this prince. And this man, Shechem, had treated their sister in a way that was unbecoming, and they went out to seek revenge. And they did so, and in doing so, they slaughtered the whole town, right? They killed all the males, and they left merely the women and children. And they didn't leave them, they took them with them. They took as plunder the women, the children, the livestock, everything. They come back into camp. Jacob sees what's happened. They were supposed to be a blessing in this land, and this is how his sons have acted. And in a time in which people, think about this, people lived behind walls of rock that they piled up to protect themselves from other people attacking them. That's how you lived. And you banded together to live with other people that you could trust, and you set honor codes up between you and them such that if they violated that, they could die. And you had these agreements with your group, and people that passed through that weren't part of that group were highly suspect. You wouldn't even allow them to have property without everyone's approval, this sort of thing. This is the kind of life that they lived in, the culture where they were in. And in that culture, Jacob's and his sons, but some of his sons came in and just slaughtered this whole town. As foreigners, they came in and did this, and they meant to live in the land. And so Jacob was terribly afraid that this was going to cause retaliation. Also, it wasn't a just killing, so he was, I'm sure, very fearful he wouldn't have God's protection. God wouldn't be with him in this because of this terrible thing. It was awful. And so in chapter 35, God appears to him and tells him, go on to Bethel, which is the place where, you remember, Jacob had made a vow to God, if you will be with me like you say you will, and you'll bring me safely back to this place, then you'll be my God, and I'll serve you all my days, and I'll give a tenth of everything to you. And he finally made it back. God called him back to that place, and there God reminded him, there he paid his vows to God, and there God reminded him of this changing of his name, that he was to be Israel, a prince of God, that God would be with him, would protect him, and would fulfill these promises to him. And so then we read about, again, this is the question of what became of Isaac. Well, we close that with, Isaac passed away. These are kind of the end of his days and how that ended. Jacob and Esau both buried him. And I think, Esau, he's still in the picture. So what's going on with Esau? Well, and we pick up in chapter 36 to talk about these are the generations of Esau. And this is simply going to carry out for us, yes, Esau abandoned the promises of God and all that God's program in the world, but what became of him? Well, he continued in the land. There were still prophecies made about him. So this is the showing how those things are filled out. And the chapter, we weren't really going to cover any of it at all as far as reading, but the chapter is broken down into these sections where it gives a genealogy of Esau's descendants in different ways. And it tells us a little bit about what happened, but then it says in verse 9, these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites in the hill country of Seir. These are the names of his sons. Then we go down, verse 15. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau, the sons of Eliphaz. So that's a different listing. And then verse 20, verse 31. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. And it goes through, and you have all these different lists, these forms of lists, where it's not clear to us exactly what they're doing. We can see that this is Esau's descendants according to this. This is Esau's descendants according to this. This is Esau's descendants according to this. And it's really strange. Like in one sense, I just say, just tell me who his descendants are. Just give me a chart and I'll figure it out. Show me the family tree and that's all we need. But if you were going to write a history of the United States of America, what would you, according to what? Like according to nationality, according to some particular family, according to political alignment, according to geographic expansion? Like how do you want to write this history? There's enough going on, there's enough people involved, enough complicated history and happenings that you kind of have to pick a vantage point. And part of what this chapter does is it shows us that God kind of made good on his promise that Esau was going to be a nation of people. You had a whole nation. Like it wasn't just Esau and a few family descendants, it was this whole nation of people. And other peoples were even, some of them were brought into this nation, and they kind of took over this whole area and became, in their own right, a very significant people. Such that when you talk about their history, to really explain how things got to where they are when the Israelites are going to come back from the Exodus, you have to list a whole host of things. You have to talk about their history in different ways in order to convey it. And that's the point of chapter 36. It's both to bring Esau's story to a fitting end, to kind of tie up these loose strings, but also to prepare the people of Israel to understand what people live in what town and what their connections were and what things are relevant for them to know about these connections. Most of these things are lost on us, but that's the nature of these lists. Some of these names and people appear later in the Bible. Most of them don't. But, for people who would walk these streets and come visit these towns, they needed to know these things. Because in this day and age, even though they might not matter to us, they did matter back then to those people. Well, this town over here, yes, it's in the midst of Edom, but these aren't really truly Edomites. These are just, they were kind of overrun and taken captive. So when you go there are certain things you might not want to say to the people that live there. It's that kind of thing. Those details are there for them as they read this. For us, not so much. But that's the point of that chapter. Now then we open up to chapter 37 to consider Jacob and what became of him. We've learned some about his life. He was this lasting piece from Isaac in God's history, in God's plan of redemption. And so what then becomes of him and his family in this whole situation where they are kind of persona non grata in the land due to the way they've acted? The fear of God is upon them. In the land, people have not wanted to attack them because God has supernaturally put a fear of them in these people's hearts. They've made their way to Bethel. Rachel's died on the way, but and Benjamin was born. They're there in Bethel. They've kind of reconsecrated themselves to God, and God has re-promised again to them. What comes of that? Chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. And you think, well, tell me about Jacob. And the very next sentence is Joseph, being 17 years old. So it's like, what became of Jacob? Well, if we're going to talk about what became of Jacob, the first thing we need to do is start talking about Joseph and the dynamics of the family and what happened with his brothers and the 12 sons of Jacob. And so this is where the story heads. This might seem strange to you, but let's just consider in this portion of Genesis, we are learning how it is that God was going to maneuver his people into slavery in a foreign land, which he foretold Abraham he would do, while at the same time forming them into a people who would learn, possess, and pass on the knowledge of God and God's ways. And this seems like a stark problem because the people are in the promised land. These boys, most of them, don't seem to be the kind to willingly become slaves. They certainly don't have any regard for the ways of God from what we've read so far. So how are you going to get these people as slaves in a foreign land loving and serving God and unified as a nation and as a people, a company of peoples with their dad? It seems impossible. And so it begins with Joseph being 17 years old. And the story starts there. How is God going to do this? All of these things that God has in mind that I just mentioned, the things that he's going to have to do, are sort of small steps toward a far greater goal which God is aiming at, namely, to bring the everlasting blessing of all the families of the earth through a specific descendant of Abraham in the future. God means to remove the offense of sin from before him. He will do that in judgment upon some. He'll remove the offense of sin by judging it in some. But for others, some from every family of the earth, irrespective of how unworthy they are, God will forgive them, not counting their sins against them. And for them, God will create faith in their hearts such that they will believe his offer of blessing. And having believed, righteousness will be counted to them freely as a gift. He will work in them the faith necessary to believe the promises, which is itself necessary to receive the promise of justification. And he did that in Abraham. He's done that in Jacob. He will do that in some of them, and he will do it for a great multitude later. But that righteousness that they'll get, that having their sins forgiven and being counted righteous, is not an end in itself, but rather an important piece of this greater blessing even yet, which is going to come to the world through a descendant of Abraham. Specifically, this descendant of Abraham will be the one to crush the serpent's head and undo the devastating cosmic work of the devil. This blessing from God, made possible by a future descendant of Abraham, will restore all mankind to the open fellowship and life with God that was once enjoyed by mankind before sin entered. It'll do it in a remade earth, which is cleansed from sin and sorrow forever. That's a tall order. And God's work at this stage of this unfolding history is not so much about creating faith in them. Think about this. What we're reading about is not so much, we'll read about it some, but not so much. The priority isn't to get faith in every single one of these people, though he does work faith certainly in some of them, but rather his concern is that some of these characters would in fact be walking with God and would know him. God is concerned with the formation of a people, a nation, who are growing in number, who are united as a family, who are led by those who know God, and who are actively involved in passing that knowledge on to their successive generations. Now think of that. What's necessary for God to create here is not a people where everyone believes, but rather a unified people, together as a family, who are led by those who know God, and in a state where the entire family is concerned with passing that knowledge about God and his ways and his promises on to the next generations. That's what he's forming in these chapters. And when it opens up, it does not sound like that will be possible when you begin reading. It's like, you get a hint that, oh, this part's good, and then it's just blown out away. You think, oh, well, this is good, and then it's blown away. And it's become so difficult to see that God will do this, except that we've already read it and know the end of the story, how it works out. So let's look at chapter 37, beginning in verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Stop there. What does that mean? We mean essentially he's out there doing all the lowly tasks like a servant boy. It's not a comparison of his age, that he was a little boy and they were grown men, but rather he was out there serving in the capacity as a boy would. And he's doing all the menial tasks, and that's what he's been given. And he's out there serving with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. That is the two servant wives. Right? He's got a younger brother from Rachel, but he's a little boy now, Benjamin. But he's out there. The sons of Leah, we've read about them some already, and he's not out there with them, but he's out there with these other servant wives and with their sons. And he comes back and he says he brought a bad report of them to their father. Often this time, at this chapter in Genesis, people interpret Joseph to be this spoiled little brat, and you shouldn't do that. The picture is Joseph as the model son, not the spoiled brat. He's the model son. You think, well, he's a tattletale. Well, not really. These men, these four sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, have been entrusted with the care of his flocks, all of his livestock. This is the family livelihood. They're old enough and grown now that they have been entrusted with this. It's like their job, right? He's their boss. And now it's time that Joseph he's a little younger than they are, but he's gone out and he's kind of low man on the totem pole, but he's out there doing his work. And while he's out there, his brothers are not performing their work and their duty as God would have them and as their father would have them do it. Whether that be not protecting the flock and neglecting them, or whether it be fighting amongst themselves, whatever it would be, somehow there's a degree of unfaithfulness on their part. And Joseph brings this bad report of them to their father. So when they get back, either Joseph leaves and comes back because it's that urgent, or when they all get back, Joseph gives a report. Listen, Dad, I don't think when you said to do this, you didn't mean that, did you? Because they were doing just the opposite of this. You said to not take them anywhere near that valley because of these people, and they had them there the whole time because it was closer. Something like that. It's not just a tattletale. It really does matter. So there's that. He gives this bad report, and it's certainly going to cause conflict. And then it's worse. Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons. And this is a problem. He should know better. Jacob knew what it was like to grow up with a father who loved his brother and not him. That was Esau. Remember, he loved Esau. Isaac loved Esau. Jacob knows what this is like. Israel knows better. But he loved him. And why did he love him? Because he was the son of his old age. This is why. So he was the one he'd wanted all along, and he was one of his last sons. He loved this boy. And, he was the only one he had from Rachel. He loved him more than any of the others. He was the son of his old age. He was the one. This son of his old age doesn't just mean, like in a sense, Benjamin was the son of his old age, not Joseph. But he was one of the last ones. And he also, it's a phrase it's the one you've chosen. It's the one you've set your eye on. He's the son of my old age. It's that kind of a statement. And because he loves him, because he's the son of his old age, and because he was the only faithful one, when the others, they were all sent out to shepherd the flock, he was the only one who was faithful in his report and in his duties. What does the father do? He makes him a robe of many colors, a royal robe, a long-sleeved or many-colored robe, a robe that stood out, that when you saw a group of men, when you saw that robe, you knew, well, that's the one in charge right there. You knew that. It was an honorific robe. And this is what he makes for him. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So they see the way that Israel favors Joseph. He loves him more than all of us. That's their assessment. Their response is they hated him. Not repentance, not, we shouldn't have done that. We need to do better. We need to be more faithful in our service. Nothing like that. They just hate him. And it's so bad they could not speak peacefully to him. Now, don't forget the things we've already read. Into this section go what? Our knowledge of these boys as they are vengeful, they are violent. These are the kinds of men, when they think you've wronged them, they slaughter your whole town and take your women and children captive. That's who they are. And they hate their brother, and they're such that they can't even speak peacefully to him. How is God going to fix this? It's going to get worse. God makes it worse. He gives Joseph a dream. Now the text says, verse 5, now Joseph had a dream. But don't miss it, because we would look at that and think, well, you just had a dream last night. It didn't mean anything. He didn't just have a dream. He had one of those dreams. You may have had a few of them in your life. You had a dream where you think, this dream is different. There's something, there's purpose, there's a message, there's something real that I'm supposed to get in this dream. I've had like one of those in my life. But most people have had a dream like that, sometime where it was, you knew this is not a dream, this is something different. And he has one of these dreams. And they believe, just like we believe most of the time, that those dreams are from God. There is purpose there. It's worth figuring out if you can figure out what this thing may mean. And Joseph had one of these dreams, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And what did he say? He said to them, hear this dream that I've dreamed. And so he's not just saying, I had a dream and I like the way what it might mean. He's saying, I dreamed one of these kinds of dreams, and I think this is from God. I don't know what it is, but let me explain it. Let me tell you what happened. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brother said, and they understand very clearly, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. There's two things. One, because they believe that God does give these kinds of dreams, the idea that Joseph would get a dream like that from God, they hate him for those dreams. But they also, it's like not only does he have God or their dad's favor, but it seems he has God's favor. And they can't stand it. And they also hate him because he told them. It's like he had the nerve to say it. So they hate him for all this. Then he dreamed another dream. He has another one of these. And he tells it to his brothers and said, behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But and he's got 11 brothers, right? But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So now his brothers, they're angry, but they're also jealous because twice now he's had these dreams from God. And they keep getting more grand, more great. He's got more authority, more power, more dominion. And they want this, and they can't believe he's getting it. So they're jealous of him. Now his father rebuked him. This is amazing. His father said, shall we indeed, shall your mother and your father, shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down on the ground before you? At the end of verse 11, but his father kept the saying in mind. Just like Mary pondering the words of Jesus. It's an amazing thing. His father kept the saying in mind, or pondering rather the words of others when Jesus was young. What does this mean? He stored them up in his heart, these dreams. What could this be? As unlikely as it seemed, as out of place and uncouth as it seemed for him to say, Dad's going to bow to me, for him to give a dream that implied that. Yet these things come from God. And so he stored them up to see, could this be? Now, so that's how tense it is. His brothers, these vengeful, murderous men, these brothers of his, hate him, cannot speak peacefully to him. But then it gets worse. He speaks and they hate him more for his dreams and more for his words, and then they're jealous on top of that. That's the condition of these brothers. And so we're not surprised. You ought to anticipate an attempted murder, because that's who they are, and that's exactly what happens. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near where? Where? Shechem. They just left there because they were worried that they were going to get murdered in revenge. And his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and you can guarantee Israel did not want that. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it's well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." He's worried, like, this is not good. They should not have gone to Shechem. Find out if they're well, and find out if the flock is all right. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. You understand, this is a lot of risk for Joseph. He's traveling now alone into the heart of Shechem, where they were not welcome, or they were worried they weren't. And he goes to Shechem. It's some 50 miles, so he's got several days' journeys, ahead of him, and he's got to get back as well. And while he comes to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan,' which is another 15 miles further on the other side." I say this is a picture, in terms of Joseph, of an obedient and faithful son. He was obedient to his father. Dad says, "Go out there and find him." He's the only one he can trust to do it, and he goes. He's courageous in that he goes to the place where he knows there's much risk to obey his father. He's faithful in that he gets there, they're not there. He doesn't turn around and say, "Oh, well, Dad sent me here, I didn't find him," so he goes back. He knows faithfulness to his father's command was not just to go to Shechem and not find them, but to find them and where they are. Get word. Tell me, I sent you to go to Shechem, and tell me how your brothers are, and tell me how the flock is. If you just do one of those three things, you've not done it. So he goes, and he goes on further to Dothan to find out how it is with his brothers and with the flock. He's everything that a son should be for his father. And then we have this profound betrayal. Verse 18, "They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him." So they see him out there in the distance. They recognize the way he walks, the coat he wears. He's far enough out they could see him, but he's not there yet. They've got time. And what do? "And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams.'" So they use the term dreamer in the ESV, and I think the NASB may as well. But that's I mentioned before, that's not really a good translation, because really it's kind of a compound description of him. It's yes, dreams is involved, but also Lord or Master. He's like the dream master or the master of dreams. Or it might say the one who is master in his dreams. It's this kind of thing. Here comes the Lord of the dreams. Here comes Dream Lord here. Here he is. Let's see what he's got to say. And so here he comes, and there's an element of, when you understand that, you see the tongue-in-cheek nature of it, the irony of what they're saying, and just you get their hatred just comes out, even just in what they call him. "Come now, let us kill him," that's step one. "Throw him into one of the pits," step two, or one of these cisterns, right, where you have water drain off, throw him into there. "Then we will lie, we'll say that a fierce animal has devoured him," and then fourth point, we'll see what becomes of his dreams. So 4 things. We're going to end the dreamer and his dreams. We're going to kill him, throw him into this pit where he won't be found. We'll lie and cover it up and say some animal devoured him, and then we'll see what happens to these dreams. But when Reuben heard of it, and remember, Reuben is the one who had made a play for prominence in the clan in a previous chapter by sleeping with his father's concubine, which is, as bizarre as it sounds in our culture, would have been for them a political statement. A statement about who's first. I've taken the women from my father's bed. That's who I am. I'm in charge. That was the attempt. He was found out and rebuked for it. He's lost his place of prominence. He was firstborn. He tried to take leadership prematurely. He was rebuked. And here comes Reuben. He says, "Well, shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. That's what he told them. But his plan was in his thinking that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. See, he wanted to regain what he lost, that position of prominence. He'd lost the birthright, but he thought I could out-scheme everyone else. I see them scheming to kill him, but if we just throw him into the pit, then when they leave, I'll come back, and then I'll take the 65-mile trip back with my brother and say, Dad, they all wanted to kill him, but I alone have saved your favorite son. That puts him back in good graces. Gets his birthright back, and this is his plan. So even those who are vying to save him are doing it, they don't care about him. They're just trying to outmaneuver one another. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. The first thing they did, get that off. They rip it off. They can't stand for him to wear it in their presence. They stripped him of his robe, that robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. So imagine how that felt, thrown down in there. But he can't swim or get his way out of it. He's down at the very bottom of this thing. There's no way out. Then they sat down to eat. They're up there. He's at the bottom of the pit. They go up there. One thing about eating, there's a lot of things about eating that I know, but one thing I know, there are certain situations where you can't eat. You're too worked up. You're too agitated. You just can't eat. It's amazing. They're so agitated by him, they can't speak a kind word to him. But leaving him for dead, they can eat. Now we can eat. Let's have a meal. All's right in the world, right? I mean, there are times where you say, Angela will call me and say, hey, it's time to eat. It's like, hang on, I've got some things I got to do first. But everything's done. They're content. It's time to eat now. It's amazing. They're up there eating. They sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw, probably on the same area where he was coming through, actually from a different direction because they're headed south, a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah has an idea. Hey, we're not making any money if we kill our brother and conceal his blood. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. So he's got an idea. It's like, look, we're all willing to kill him, or we were willing to kill him, but now we're just going to leave him in the pit and let him die. That's kind of one step removed. We didn't actually shed his blood. We just, put him in the pit, and he just didn't make it out. So that's fine. We did that. And we'll lie to Dad and all those things. That doesn't bother us. But, we've not shed his blood, but so we're not as bad as we could be. But, if we could sell him to others, then it's not really our hand upon him. We're not the one, we just sold him to these other people. And not only do we give him to them, and it's up to them what happens to him, it's not on us, but also, so we got to get that immunity here. But also, we make some money. We can ruin his life, destroy the dream, still lie to Dad, still, vie for who's going to have the birthright now, amongst ourselves, and make money. This seems like a lot better deal. And so they all are convinced, yeah, let's make a buck while we do it. And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And then they took Joseph to Egypt. And so that's how it happened. Now, we don't read it in this scene. We could imagine at this scene what this scene would look like, Joseph coming up, and what would he say as they're selling him and stuff. But we read later that he was pleading with them with tears not to do this. But they did it anyway. And then Reuben, who evidently had been gone, his plan was, let's do this, then he leaves. He's thinking they would have moved on by now. He comes back. When he comes back to the pit, he sees that Joseph was not in the pit. And his plan's thwarted. He tears his robes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone. And where shall I go? And it's like such a confession. You can imagine them all thinking, what do you mean? What does that have to do with you? Then they all starts to dawn on them, oh, he had some sort of a plan here. He was going to, this was going to be better for him in some way. They all know what happened. Verse 31, then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." So recognize this. And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. All right, so we close this chapter kind of in the Promised Land with Jacob having received this garment. He sees, he recognizes this is indeed that robe. It's been torn to shreds. It's covered in blood. There's no way somebody survived this. This is all you found. You didn't find the body. You just found this. Well, then he's been devoured by some animal or something. Because a person would just, if they slaughtered him, would leave him for dead. You wouldn't like take the body and leave the robe. That wouldn't happen. You probably might kill the body and take the robe because it's such a valuable robe. But so this is what happens. He sees it. He begins to mourn. And so for many days. And then what happens? After a period of time, all his sons and all his daughters rise up to comfort him. Imagine what empty comforters those sons would be. Feigning, come on, Dad, it's not that bad. Like, why am I the only one crying in camp, right? This would be the idea. It's just absurd. How do you comfort him? He refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. I will mourn him as I'm mourning till I die." This won't end. That's what he says. Thus the father wept for him. It doesn't look too likely that this is going to happen. Now, the only hint of anything is it's like the family needs to be righteous. The only righteous one is no longer with the family. But the family needs to be slaves in a foreign land. And the first one is now a slave in a foreign land. It's kind of all you've got. The family needs to be together. Well, they're not together entirely, and it gets worse. So chapter 38, we're going to digress from Joseph, but it's not a digression because the question is what happened to Jacob and his sons, not what happened to Joseph. So don't see this as a digression. Moses is right on point. It happened at that time, Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. And anyway, he's got another son, three sons, Er, Onan, and Chezib. Okay, so what happens here? Judah, about this time all this happens, father's mourning, inconsolable, Judah leaves. It says he went down from his brothers. So he gets in a dispute with his brothers about something, likely their guilt or whatever. But he decides he's leaving. Just like Esau left the family and wanted nothing to do with them, so also Judah now leaves. He's out, he's done, his time with the family is over. There's nothing for him here. He turns aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira, some man who becomes a friend of his. And he sees some woman, some daughter of a Canaanite man whose name's Shua, and he takes her. He sees her, takes her, went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. Anyway, he's got these three kids, pretty well in quick succession. They begin to grow up. Judah takes a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. What kind of sons does Judah have? He goes, he leaves everything that he had in the promised the family of promise. And he goes to dwell with these Canaanites, and he makes a life for himself, and his firstborn son is wicked in the sight of the Lord. We don't know, we're not told why or what was so wicked, but the Lord put him to death. The last time we've read about a person or people who were so wicked that God had to just kill them was Sodom and Gomorrah. And you ought to be reading this in that light. Er is on the side of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's like them. Judah has gone and raised a family like those men. Wicked like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That doesn't mean he's committing the same specific sins, but he's on their level as a sinner. So then Judah does the responsible thing that a father would do at that time. says to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." This was a cultural practice that they had. It was important that the family names continued and family lines continued and lineage. Judah, it's amazing, he leaves his own family to establish something. He leaves his house of his father to establish this family, and he cares so much that it be established right. He takes a wife for his son. He denied his father that right. He took a wife himself. But he himself, when it comes to his own children, he takes the wife for them, arranges the marriage for them, and then now he's got one son that dies. What does he do? He tells the other son, "Hey, you have a duty here." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, right? And so, verse 10, and what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. So Judah says, "Look, man, maybe the problem is this woman. Maybe she's the problem. Maybe she's the reason my kids are dying." It wasn't the reason at all. He had wicked sons. His sons were so wicked, God put him to death. Tamar hasn't done anything here. But Judah says, "Look, man, maybe she's the problem. I'll tell you what, Tamar, why don't you just go over to your father's house again," which is a dishonorable thing for him to do to her. "You go there, have your father take care of you, and then once my son Shelah, a few more years, once he's ready in a marriageable age, then you can have him. He'll perform the duty to you." In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Now Judah's without a wife. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. So that's one side of things for Judah. His wife dies, and now he's going through a period of grieving, and he's comforted. He's ready to kind of move on, begin life again. And he goes up to Timnah to his sheep shearers. He goes up to Timnah. That's a place of religious observance and festivals and things like that will happen up there. The sheep are sheared there. He goes up with his buddy, and they're kind of on their way. It's part of a Canaanite practice. They're going to go up there. But on her side, Tamar, also setting this up, you need to know this, Tamar had been told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So what does she do? Well, she takes off her widow's garments, covers herself. She's still wearing widow's garments for these years. Covered herself with a veil, wraps herself up, sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage, so he's not been doing what he said he would do for her. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Married women who were cult prostitutes, temple prostitutes, would wrap themselves up, sit by the roadside, and invite men to come into them, pay their fees, and this was all part of religious observance. They have their false gods who are gods of fertility. You perform a sexual act, a sexual rite with a cult prostitute, and you pay them money, and you gain favor with these gods for your crops the next year. And so he comes. Now we know that you don't seek the comfort of a prostitute just for good crops. He's also a lonely man who's now comforted after the death of his wife. So he comes, and he sees her, and he hires her out. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come into you, for he did not know what she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "Well, what do you give me?" Right? Now, it's important that you understand, not be grossed out by the details of this, and understand rather, just like we would be grossed out by the one brother sleeping with her to provide offspring, we're kind of grossed out by this idea that she chooses now her father-in-law. The question for her, in her mind, and I don't say she's justified in this, but you need to understand her position, is my only way forward in the world, and the only way to honor my dead husband, is to provide him with children in his name from his family. This should be done by his brothers. The other brother refused to do this and died. Now, the next brother is being withheld from me. What can I do to save my husband's legacy? I'm going to take advantage of his father, and I will raise up children for him in this way. And this is her position. Now, without going into all the details. But it does say in verse 22, when he's later looking for her, that the men describe a cult prostitute. This is who he thought she was. So, she wants, the price to be a young goat from the flock. And he says, well, I'll send it to you. And she says, well, I need a pledge. I need something that will make you honor this. And essentially she asked for his ID, right? A ring, the staff, these sort of things, all the things that would identify him for business and trade. He can't really do anything without these. This is a big deal. It'd be like saying, give me your entire wallet and your social security number, and we'll call it good until you pay me. It's like, you're going to come good on this because you can't go without those things. And this is the price she requires for him to make payment. So all of this happens. She wisely leaves afterwards and takes all these things with her so that when she ends up pregnant, if she ends up pregnant, she can prove who the father is. And she was very shrewd in that. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral because she's pregnant. Moreover, she's pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Whew! She's dishonored my family name and my son's name by doing this, right? Let her be burned. He's not much different than he and his brothers were to the Shechemites. She's immoral, burn her. And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I'm pregnant. And she said, please identify who these are. Recognize, what is this? The signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she's more righteous than I. And he knows already what it's about. Since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he didn't know her again. It wasn't a relationship they had. It was an event that happened. And so he realizes she's righteous. She had the righteous concern. She maybe didn't act in a perfectly righteous way, but she's more righteous than he is. Deep repentance. I mean, he goes from burn her to she's more righteous than I. There's no way for him to make this confession privately. He's enacted a set of events. Send for her. Like people came, hey, there's rumors going around about this woman. And everybody can see she's pregnant. They give him word. He says, send word, bring her out to the square, burn her. She's in process of being brought. She sends these things to him. He gets them and he has to say, hold everything. She's more righteous than I. I failed her and my son and my own family name in these ways. There's no way to do that privately. Very public repentance. When the time of her, and he could have said, well, now that I guess that she's my wife, then I get to enjoy her as a wife. No, he knew he had done wrong, and he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, what a breach you've made for yourself. Therefore his name is called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. All right. And you think, what does this have to do with anything? What we see is one of the worst of the brothers, Judah, who was just interested in making money on his brother's misery. It got so bad he left the family. Everyone else was still at least living as a family. He left. He went in wholesale with the way of the Canaanites. But in his path of wickedness, God cut him off. In his path of wickedness, God reproved him. God killed his sons for their own wickedness. God killed his wife. Brought about this whole situation where in his sin and immorality, he actually was found out. And God brought repentance. He brought repentance. We don't read about it here just yet, but you'll understand that later when all the family is together, Judah has returned. He comes back. So you see this unlikely work of repentance in the heart of Judah. One of the worst of the boys, now repentant, understanding some of what righteousness is really all about. Despite the 22, we know it is, years that he's in this situation, a prodigal, he comes back. with a concern for righteousness and deep lessons having been learned. Okay, now, what else? We come to chapter 39. Joseph, return to his story. Verses 1 through 10, we read about Joseph in Potiphar's house. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. How many times do we read in there, God was with him, God blessed him, God helped him, God provided, God made him succeed? It's just continual. And what you see is the faithfulness of Joseph still when he's in service to do everything that he's supposed to do, and you see the faithfulness of God to be with Joseph, to uphold him. God, after all, gave him these dreams. God can't just abandon him now. You see the favor that Joseph gains with Potiphar. You also see the favor that Joseph already has with God. And then we read now, in these next few verses, about Joseph in the midst of temptation and the fear of God that he has. Verse 7, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in his house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. She speaks to him day after day. At this point, the tension is high. He's in a precarious position. He's just a servant. He's been given charge over everything. For whatever reason, he finds himself often left alone with the woman of the house. And she is wealthy. She's powerful. Her family has got a position of power in the land. Her husband is in charge of the king's jail. And this is not the guy you want to offend and be on the wrong side of, but this woman keeps persisting in her temptations to him and trying to get him to join her in infidelity with regard to her husband. He resists this temptation on a number of levels. Right? One, it would, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house. It would be a betrayal to my master, who has entrusted me with everything. That's one thing. 2, he himself has expressly kept you out from under my charge because you're his wife. It never included charge over you, to do with you however I see fit. 3rd, because of that would be a great wickedness, but further, it would be a sin against God. And that ends it for him. How could I do this sin against God? And she speaks to him day after day like this. And again, the tensions are high. His situation is precarious. And finally, it changes. Sometime in the midst of this, day after day after day, she decides she's going to force the issue. One day, right, he goes into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. So now she tries to force the issue. She's so desperate. But he leaves his garment. He tries to get away, and she's holding on to it, and he just kind of wiggles out of the garment, and he runs out, fleds out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house, she thinks, I've got to do something. This isn't good. He's going to be out of the house the minute people are going to see him without his garments. He's going to have to give an explanation. I better come up with a story before he does. So she says what? As soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled the house, she called to the men of her household and says to them, see, he has brought a Hebrew among us to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. So she starts blaming her husband. My husband brought this Hebrew in, and he's there to take advantage of us. Look what he did to me. He tried to lie with me, and I cried out, I screamed, no, no, no. And He ran away. He was so afraid he was going to get caught. Then eventually his master hears the words that his wife spoke to him. And she says, "This is the way your servant treated me." And when that happened, Potiphar's anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So he put him into the prison he was in charge of. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, we just could ask ourselves, just for a moment, why, if God means to move the family to Egypt and have them be slaves, and if He means to fulfill these dreams to Joseph and have them all bow to Joseph, what purpose, what is the reason for having him be so mistreated and lied about and go through all these things? He's building a certain character in this man through suffering. He's got him in the crucible. Joseph is learning things. He's maturing. He's growing. Now, he's been righteous all the way through this, but he's learning lessons. Like you can be righteous, you can perfectly pass all the tests that are put on you and still not be ready for the next test until you go through a few more things. He's passing with flying colors, everything. He's doing wonderfully, but he's still going to have to go through the hardship to be ready for the next thing. And also God is maneuvering him, as we'll see, to be in a situation where he can actually have audience with Pharaoh and have Pharaoh's respect from the outset, which would never have happened having been brought here as a servant initially. It's an amazing thing. So he's in prison. But the keeper of the prison, verse 22, put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So God, he's still going through all the hardship, but in the midst of it, God is with him, and everything continues to prosper. He at once has both every reason to think God's abandoned him, and at the same time, every reason to think God's upholding him. And God is upholding him. He's not abandoned him. The Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. All of this time, what's in his mind? These dreams I had, they were from God. I had these dreams. The next thing I know, I'm honored by my dad. Things seem to be headed that way. And then now I'm here in Egypt. I'm a slave, but God sees fit to let me rise. But then I'm cast down again, and then there God sees fit to let me rise. And he has another opportunity, chapter 40. It seems like the opportunity has come to get him out and get him free, and he's finally going to begin his straightforward ascent to power in some way. I don't know how that's going to happen in Egypt where they're under a Pharaoh, but nonetheless, it looks like it might happen. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord, their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So that they're there for a while. They kind of get to have a bit of a relationship with Joseph because he's the one attending to them specifically. It's not yet known what's going to happen to these men, if they'll be left there or if they'll be brought back. And so in the meantime, you don't put them with the general population. You put them in their own place, and you have them directly ministered to by your most trustworthy servant, namely Joseph. And he's doing this. But one night, what happens? They dream. They have these dreams. And they are similar and different. They tell them to, Joseph comes in, the men are very distraught, they're worried. They had those dreams, again, that kind of dream that you have. And they were very distraught, didn't know what this might mean. And so Joseph says, look, interpretations belong to God. Tell them to me. I know God, and He can give these interpretations. Tell them to me, maybe He'll give them to you. Maybe He'll provide me with an interpretation to give to you. So they tell him his dreams. And the result, Joseph tells them, look, okay, in 3 days, you're going to be lifted up, your head's going to be lifted up, and you are going to be, put back in service to Pharaoh. The other one thinks, oh, good, I can't wait to tell him my dream, because it'll probably be similar. He says, yeah, your head's going to be lifted up too in 3 days, but off your body. And so that's the interpretation. So the 3 days come, and sure enough, they're sent for, and it's a feast for Pharaoh's birthday. He brings these men in, and the chief baker, he restores, or the cupbearer, he restores, rather, the baker, he kills. And the cupbearer, remember Joseph said, just look, when you leave, remember me. Please don't leave me in here. And of course he forgot about it. So we're at chapter 41, then 2 whole years follow. And then eventually this dream comes. Now, I want to stop here at the end of chapter 40 and just be done with our time for today. And all I want us to see, and this is really the big picture of things right now, is just the way God is working in this. As many as the obstacles were, you could have maybe charted a far more direct way to fulfill the promises, but God's not interested in that. God uses means to get to His ends. And sometimes those are long and winding. But always, when you look back, every step was necessary. Like, I can't imagine that Joseph was the kind of, would have had it in him, as good as he was, to just forgive his brothers the way he did. If he hadn't been through this hardship, seen even the fate of these two men and the look in their eyes when he interprets their dreams and see what happens. All these kinds of things matter. They're so significant. If he hadn't spent all these years wrestling with what it means, trying to fit together, blessing was going to come to the world through these descendants of Abraham. And I'm meant to rule over my brothers. I got to fit he gets to the place where he fits those two things together. It's not just, I'm in charge, despite the fact that you thought it would never happen. Eat dust. That's not the attitude. Instead, he sees himself as a means to bless his family, to bless the whole world, in fact. And he does bless the whole world in a way with food. It's incredible. And so, to see, as unlikely as it was, when Judah left the family, you thought, that's the end of it. It's never going to come to pass. You would not have imagined that 20 years later, Judah would be brought to heel at the activity of God and repent toward God and come back to the family and begin to be restored. It's incredible. But this is what happened, as unlikely as it is. How are these 11 brothers and all their division and all their hatred and Joseph going to be united together with their dad in Egypt, prospering, delighting in God, learning of God, enjoying God, passing lessons of God on to their descendants? How will that ever happen? It doesn't seem likely now, but God works it out. And that's what we read about in the rest of this section, what we'll cover next time I speak. Are there any questions over anything we've covered today in this story? I know we've gone through all this in detail at length before, but to get it again in this way and see where things are and all that's up in the air right now, I think is very helpful. So, anything at all? Questions or comments?